Hi there, we are on chapter 4 of I Am David. David had never seen a forest before. He had had a lift that morning and come a long way by car, and although he wanted to waste no time, he thought he might spend an hour or two finding out what a forest looked like. He liked it at first, but after a while he began to feel uneasy. You could hide behind the tree trunks, and so could they. He realized well enough that they were not likely to wander around a forest just in case they might find someone. They always knew whom they were after, and even if they were looking for him, they would not be hiding in a forest on the off chance that he might pass by. Nevertheless, he felt more at ease when he was out in the open again. David preferred places where he could see what was coming far enough ahead of him. Let me try that again. David preferred places where he could see what was coming far enough ahead for him to hide if he felt suspicious. He could not yet make up his mind whether they were really after him or not. If they were, it was not because he knew anything. Johannes had always said every time a new prisoner entered the camp, "Don't tell the boy anything they may try to warn him out of afterward." Later on, when Johannes was dead, others had said the same thing, and the man had known that. But there was always the possibility that he was a useful hostage. Suppose, for example, he had had a father, and that father had been their enemy. Then they might have threatened him with the fact that they had David in their power. Not that David really believed it could be so. He could not imagine ever having had a father. But he had to reckon with the possibility that there was some reason that made it necessary for them to find him, and that was as near as he could get. He was suddenly aware of a strange sound. He looked quickly around and threw himself down behind a clump of bushes. There he was again, walking along and thinking without even looking where he was going. There was a house close by. He could see it among the trees, a large house and beautiful to look at, almost like a church. What was that sound? It was strange, yes, and wonderful too. When he was in Naples, he had seen a balloon. If you could turn into a balloon, that sound was what you might feel like, as if you had a great space inside you and it was filled with air, a heavenly air full of sweet voices that made you fly up and up and your heart beat faster and faster, not because you were afraid, but because you were happy? Was that what happiness felt like? David knew he was listening to music. There had once been a musician in the camp, and before he had been there long enough to lapse into silence, he had talked about music and tried to explain what it sounded like. But David had not understood. He understood now, however. That sound that seemed to flood into every fiber of your being and draw you upward and upward, that was all the instruments playing together. And that thin, delicate sound that made your heart beat so fast, that must be the violin. One morning, by the side of a little stream, he had found a red flower. A drop of water had fallen onto its red petals, and a ray of sunshine had caught it and made it tremble on the flower in David's hand and glisten with many colors. And David thought that if a ray of light from the sun could have made a drop of water speak, its voice would have been like the clearest notes of the violin. "What the devil, you young thief, forcing your way into people's grounds in broad daylight? I'll show you. You come here and I'll give you a good hiding." The voice felt like an explosion on David's ears. The wonderful sound of the music lay murdered, crushed, and kicked to death by an evil voice. He just managed to catch sight of a boy, a black-haired boy with spiteful, ill-natured eyes, before he was knocked down and trying to ward off the blows. It was impossible to get away, for the boy was as big as himself, and to escape would mean hitting back. David shielded his head against the boy's kicks and clenched his teeth. The blows began to lose some of their force, and the boy seemed to hesitate. "So you won't hit back, eh? Scared to fight, I suppose?" David did not answer, and the boy set about him again, but less violently this time, rather as if he felt he had to. "Use your fist, you young swine." No. The boy appeared to have grown tired of striking him, at least for the moment, and David sat up with blood streaming from his nose. "You seem to enjoy a good hiding. Maybe you like me for giving you one." The boy's voice was provocative. David regarded him calmly. "No, I don't. I hate you, and I'd hate you just as much as if it had been anyone else you hit. I wouldn't care if you fell dead right now. At least I'd be sure you'd never look at anything beautiful again." The strange boy looked astonished. "Why don't you fight then?" he asked crossly. "'Cause if I hit you back, I'd be no better than you are. I'd be just as rotten and worthless, and I'd have no right to be free." The strange boy grinned at him, but there was a look of uncertainty about him as his eyes shifted uneasily. "You're not all there," he said. "Who do you think you're talking to?" "I don't think. I know. I'm talking to someone who likes using brute force. And that's why I don't want to talk to you anymore. You can hit me again if you can catch me." With that, David jumped up smartly and ran off. He could not run very quickly because he was beginning to ache all over where the other boy had struck him. But the strange boy did not follow him. He only shouted, "Idiot, you're a crazy coward." David had the impression that he was shouting loudly for his own benefit. David was sick, and every time he thought about the young stranger, he felt like being sick again. He found it difficult to understand that people who were well off here in Italy, where they had so much food to eat and were surrounded by such beauty of sea and countryside, could still love violence. That boy was just like the guards in the camp, the only difference being that the guards did not leave off striking till their victims lost consciousness. The boy, of course, had only had his bare hands to strike with and had tired of the effort too soon. For a moment, David was tempted to think that perhaps there was no good people at all outside concentration camps. But then he reminded himself of the sailor and Angelo and the English people who might have been ignorant but were certainly not bad. And then when he was living among the rocks overhanging the seas, there had been the man with the loaves. He had not been bad either. He had just not been brave enough to let a boy go without giving him away. Not for more than a few days at any rate. Yes, he felt there must be somewhere where everybody was kind and decent. A free country where people did not believe violence was a good thing. And he would find a free country if he could do it before he was caught again. But first of all, he must have a thorough wash, he thought. He thought from the lay of the land that there was probably a river nearby. There was, a large one too, although it was partly dried up as rivers usually were in the summertime. David took his clothes off and put them in the water, and he scrubbed himself thoroughly all over. His soap would soon be worn thin at that rate, but he did not care. He must not leave a spot unwashed where the boy had touched him. Not until all contact with him had been washed away would David be able to feel free again. He washed his hair, too, and then he took off his clothes out of the water and spread them to dry. He lay down beside them and made an effort to calm himself and forget the boy. Much better to recall what the music had sounded like. Had there been a large orchestra inside that fine house, or had it been a radio? He was startled by the sound of voices not far away. He pulled his wet clothes toward him. A large boulder provided good cover on one side, and in front of him the trunk of an olive and rows of close-growing vines, old and gnarled, completely hid him from view when he ducked down. It was some children playing, and David decided he would watch them. He usually hurried away when he saw children. He was afraid of them. He had never spoken to children, and he did not know how to begin. From the very first day when he had made his home among the rocks, he had made up his mind to avoid children. They were much more dangerous than grown-ups, except them, of course. They were more dangerous because it was easier for them to see how different he was. Grown-ups could not really remember what children were like, so Johannes had once said, but other children would very soon discover that he knew nothing of the things they took for granted. One thing alone would give him away. He had no idea how to play. People were always talking about children playing, but playing seemed to mean so many different things that David had given up trying to find out what it was. There were so many more important things to learn about, and as long as he avoided children, there was no need for him to be able to play. But since he could not get away now until they left, he might as well just watch them. He parted the vines cautiously so that he could see. There were two little boys, much smaller than himself, and a girl who was somewhat bigger, though still quite young. Shouting and laughing, and all three talking at once, they were running around a small building, not the sort of place people lived in, but where they kept tools and wheelbarrows and baskets for fruit picking. David could not take his eyes off the girl. She had black curly hair, very long and tied with a red ribbon, and everything about her was beautiful. Not just her fine dress, but everything. Her laughter sounded like the light tinkling of polished glass, and when she moved, she reminded David of a flower swaying in the wind. They said they were going to play something they called Davy Crockett and the Indians. First, the little boys were to be the Indians. They would capture the girl, shut her up in the shed, and go off. Then when they came back, they would pretend to be Davy Crockett and set her free. David thought it sounded silly, but that was probably because he did not really know what ordinary children were like. As far as he was concerned, he had no desire to be anyone but himself. He might feel differently about other things, like wanting to stay free long enough to find a country where he could live in safely, but he would always want to be David. That was why he was determined to go on living that morning. He had come across the rock. As long as he had been a prisoner in the concentration camps, he had not cared what happened to him. He had followed the others' examples and done as he was told, but that had not been living. But from that morning, when he first fully realized he was an individual person called David, free and able to think for himself, everything had been different. No, David felt quite sure he would never pretend to be anyone else. The girl had gone into the shed now, and so there was nothing more to watch. He was very tired, too, and thought he might just as well take a nap before the little boys returned, and they all went off and left him free to go on his way. David was awakened by shouting and crying and a strange smell in the air. It's on fire! It's on fire! It's all your fault, Setcha! You thought of it! You know very well we aren't allowed to play with fire! It was the two little boys, and it was the shed that was on fire. What shall we do? Run and get Carlo, Setcha! Oh, if only she didn't get burned up while you're gone! Both the little boys were crying, and one of them set off running in the direction David had come from, and the other just stood there and wept. She was burning. The girl. It was the girl they were talking about now. The little girl who looked so like a flower was inside that fire. David sprang up and took a step forward, and then he turned around, and grabbing his clothes, he flung them into the river and jumped in after them. They were now sopping wet again, and so many thoughts flashed through his mind as he ran that it seemed like hours before David reached the shed. A man in the camp had once escaped from a burning building by wrapping wet clothes around his head to keep the smoke out and prevent himself from losing consciousness. And he had not been burned about the face. If only he could get her out now. The shed wall was no longer burning so fiercely, but the door was a regular bonfire. And all those dry leaves and stalks the roof was made of, he would have have her out before the fire got on a proper hold of them. He was just going to call on God to help him when a thought occurred to him. God certainly would not want that little girl, so like a flower and so beautiful to look at, to die. Here, then, was something he could do for God in return. He could not say it aloud because he was running too hard, and so he said it to himself, God of the green pastures and the still waters, please, please don't help me. I want to do it myself so that you'll know I found something I can do for you. I am David. Amen. And by the time he had reached the burning shed, the little boy who had stayed behind was still crying. And David could hear other voices down by the river, but he had no time to look around. With all the speed he could muster, he undid his bundle and took out his knife, picked up his wet clothes again, and with one hand he held his trousers up in front of his nose and mouth, and then he sprang into the blazing fire. It's the end of part 1 of chapter 4.